I'm also a tapestry curator, and I promise this is relevant because 15 years ago, I was in Miami making a pilgrimage to the Bass Museum, looking for an old tapestry. And that is when, unexpectedly, I walked into their main exhibition space and saw 10,000 waves, encountered 10,000 waves for the first time. Isaac's spectacular multi-screen film installation that is now in the Willsey Court here at the De Young. I was really overwhelmed by it. As some of you may know, the film confronts the 2004 tragedy of Morecambe Bay in England, when 23 undocumented Chinese migrants were drowned while harvesting cockles. As is characteristic in Isaac's oeuvre, the work blends visual poetry, myth, research, and social critique in a way that compels viewers to look anew at histories and dynamics and events that shape the complex world we live in and which often defy straightforward, linear narrative description. 10,000 Waves stopped me in my tracks 15 years ago. And when I came here as director at the end of 2018 and started working with Claudia Schmuckli, she, in one of our early conversations, said that she would love to organize a large exhibition of Isaac's work, and I didn't have to be sold any further. Fast forward to today, and thanks to the hard work of Claudia, Isaac, and the amazing teams here at the Fine Art Museums and in Isaac's own studio, it's a great honor for the Fine Art Museums to present the first survey of Isaac Julien's multi-channel moving image work in the United States. The show features 10 major video installations made between 1999 and last year, 5 of them newly restored for this occasion, alongside select early works, including his iconic film Looking for Langston of 1989. And indeed, Isaac Julien, I Dream a World is the largest exhibition of its kind to date. For our visitors who are familiar with Isaac's work, we hope that this exhibition provides a rare chance to look again at the full oeuvre and appreciate its richness. And for the many visitors, on the other hand, who will be experiencing the work for the first time, we're excited to be able to be the venue for that spellbinding experience. I guess also on a personal note, I'm especially pleased that 10,000 Waves is installed in the Willsey Court upstairs, which is one of the free areas of the museum, making it especially accessible to anybody who comes to the museum. We're incredibly grateful to the legion of extraordinary organizations and people who have championed Isaac's work and who have helped support this exhibition. And I do just want to call out Jessica Silverman, who's with us this afternoon and has been such a champion of Isaac's work here in San Francisco. Before I introduce Claudia Schmuckli, I also want to say an absolute heartfelt thanks to Isaac for his collaboration, for entrusting the Fine Art Museums with this presentation, and for creating work that engenders empathy and compassion at a time when these values are so much under attack. And I want to thank Claudia, the museum's now named the Holly Johnson and Parker Harris Chief Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, thanks to a wonderful endowment by Holly Johnson and Parker Harris just a few weeks ago. Claudia has really, I think, turbocharged the modern and contemporary program at the Fine Art Museums since she joined in 2016. And she has carried out critical work elevating artists' voices and perspectives, both at the De Young and at the Legion, through a series of exhibitions and interventions, such as last year's Leeming Way, Rituals of Care, Kahinda Wiley, An Archaeology of Silence 2 years ago, Judy Chicago, a retrospective 3.5 years ago, and Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI, and Wengechi Mutu, I Am Speaking, Are You Listening, both of which were featured as we came out of COVID. So it's an amazing roster of achievement, and I think without further ado, let me welcome Claudia to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for this kind introduction. I brought Isaac right with me. After your introduction, I don't need to do another formal one for Isaac, and we can just jump right into our conversation. Not without, of course, me also expressing my deepest thanks to you, Isaac, for going on this incredible journey with me over the past few years. It's been a breathless ride, and I'm so incredibly, profoundly grateful for the outcome. So.
And I have to say it's been an amazing experience, and I'm incredibly impressed by your kind of tenacity and ambition and foresight and vision, and we'll talk about that.
We will.
But
okay.
But
yes,
enabled a whole, transformation of very early works, 8 works in all, where we had to go back to their sort of filmic origins, regrade them, re-edit them, and to follow the path of Adam Finch's, in a way, tapestry-like editing, and to basically make them shine bright and new, 4K, and that's for the very first time this exhibition. That, I think, is one of the things that you allowed us to do, which I'm very grateful to Claudia, so thank you.
Let's dive in. One of the terms that you use to describe your work at large is it being a poetics of reparations, poetics of resistance maybe. Bringing together all these works from your career, I'm really interested in hearing you speak about the shape of those poetics and how it has evolved over time. Because you haven't always made multi-channel video work. You started as an experimental filmmaker. You spent about a decade making single-channel films that, both alone and in collaboration with the Sankofa Film and Video Collective, that were inspired both by political, cultural events in Thatcherite England, but were also just as much about the politics of representation. And it is only in the late 90s that you then sort of segued to the multi-screen format, which this exhibition is dedicated to, and that really was your introduction into the art world at large and what we know you best for. But I would love to hear from you, how you conceive of these poetics, and sort of how you see that evolving.
That's a great question. Thank you, Claudia. I think I could sort of begin, my story in relationship to someone who studied, art schools at Martin School of Art, along with Adam Finch, who has worked. We both underwent a course which was a sort of experimental film and video art course, but it was very rigorous, and we were very lucky, I think, to be exposed to all of these different film practices and video art practices at quite an early age. I studied painting, sculpture, and photography, and I think I've always been interested in how I could embellish all those forms in the work that I was making. But when I graduated and formed the Sankofa Film Video Collective with my various college art school friends, we wanted to enter into the field of film as a way of trying to change the rules of representation that we saw then, or felt then, in terms of our practice, in terms of what we were doing. Because we weren't very happy with the dominant forms and the things that people took for granted. We wanted to pull the rug underneath people's feet and to highlight the kind of, let's call it technology, or the kind of cinematic aspects of film in both painterly ways, but also in ways that might, question, how you looked at images, and so, we made a few experiments. Some were very good, some were not, I would say. And, one of the experiments that came out, I think, quite, what I felt satisfied with was Looking for Langston, 1989. And I would say that that work is work which I can now say, retrospectively, uses the aesthetic of critical fabulation, which I wasn't aware of. It's something which, when I came to teach at Santa Cruz, that students would say to me, this is using the critical fabulation kind of aesthetic. And it was really in that moment that I realized that this speculative fiction or poetic approach to the archive, because of course that work took, I made a film very early on called How Gays Are Stereotyped in the Media, and my professor said to me, well, it'd be very good, but maybe next time you can make a work called How Black Gays Are Stereotyped in the Media. And I thought, good question. And it took me 10 years really to think about that, and it, in the end, produced a work like Looking for Langston. And I think it was also, how would you approach the archive where there's erasure or absences? And I think it took a time for me to be able to view that by having lots of inquiries and meeting people like B. Ruby Rich, who's here in the audience, and basically, asking lots of questions about the Harlem Renaissance, about Langston Hughes, and in a way beginning to piece together, along with my partner Mark Nash, who was working on the archival research for that film, and we came across amazing materials from the Harman Foundation, which was looking at the Harlem Renaissance painters. It was a 1920s archival film, which was meant to be a kind of slightly propaganda film about people working and getting jobs and, finding careers. And the Harman Foundation was a wonderful foundation that supported African-American artists. And I was fascinated by the footage, because the Harlem Renaissance was never taught when I was a student at art school as part of the modernist history of art history, a canon really in American art history. And so this moment, this historical moment for me, I like the idea of looking at the archive as springboards for reinvention, that the archive could be springboards for reinvention, for reimagination, for rearticulation, and that could only happen through a poetic approach of looking at these moments and then taking, as it were, figures from these moments and reimagining them, but based on some historical evidence or fact or information, but then to bring them into another space. So I would say that's one strategy of a poetic approach to form in terms of reinvigorating certain histories. But the form question is really important, because I think it also connects to the question of montage, and this is where the tapestry montage part comes out, because only through thinking about montage as a form of bricolage or reverting to things like things that we learned when we were art school students, Eisenstein's montage of attractions, how you produce the third meaning when you're making images. And I think, myself and Adam, that we carry that language and we want to bring it forward into a new space. And we're only able to do that really through the advent of the new technologies, because, when we first started editing multiple screen works, we edited them, we'd make an edit, it's between analog and digital, and we would, say, okay, well, let that terminate for, 10 hours, come back and look at it. And then we'd get the results. Oh, that looks good, that doesn't look good. And it's really with the advent of digital technology that you'd be able to make works where you could really start to experiment. Now, Adam's saying he can talk about it much better than I can around those aesthetic strategies. But I would say that those aesthetic strategies also, in a way, give that kind of approach to the form and expand the form. And yes, I did make narrative forms, and I think I still do to some extent, but I found the cinema space has been too prohibitive, and I felt that people were having much more fun in the museum and gallery spaces. Early film video makers like Douglas Gordon, for example, and of course we can think of, the expanded cinema aesthetic as being another moment, and people who taught us, like Malcolm McGrice, had worked in that way of making films. But I think the kind of chance for being able to reformulate these sorts of things really came about in the opportunity to make The Long Road to Mazatlan in Art Pace, which is when I first met you, Claudia, all those years ago, and really, the rest is history to some extent.
To some extent, yes. But we do have a few images of Long Road to Mazatlan here, as well as, your basically other early work, if we want to call it that, in this format, Paradise Amorous later on. I'd love sort of to talk a little bit about, the progression that you made in terms of thinking about moving to multiple screens, which you're doing here for the first time. And for those of you who don't know who Adam Finch is, he is Isaac Julien's editor and has worked with him for the entirety of his career. And so I just wanted to acknowledge and thank him, since Isaac has made reference to him several times.
So Adam, you should stand up.
Yeah, so...
We'd like to see you.
Yeah.
There he is.
There he is.
He's
Thanks,
the magician. It's him.
Yeah. He might have to come down here and answer a few questions
You
later
might
on.
do, Adam. Yeah.
But here we are. We're looking at an installation shot from Long Road of Mazatlan, actually from our installation. I was very happy to get the images in time to include some of them in this presentation. And what we're looking at is a presentation on a wall, still sort of like in a flat format, presented a little bit like a painting, like a triptych, and you've talked about that. So this was your first foray. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the thinking behind this sort of presentation, which also, I would like to say, we have, for the purposes of this exhibition, emulated how it was first shown, because it was not shown sort of in a, darkened space, not as, with sort of the dramatic sort of mystery, let's say, that an installation like Lessons of the Hour or, other works that came after has, but actually in what was a still very white cube-like environment. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the thought process behind that, and then how we move away from there.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think in a way, with The Long Road to Mazatlan, it was a work which, through the Art Pace residency, gave me the opportunity to think about making multiple screen work that would work in both this sort of painterly fashion, but also at the same time try to turn inside out some of the arguments that people were making at the time about the black cube and the white box debate. You know, Raymond Buller, all those people in Film Fairy. And I mean, I think what I was interested in doing was to use the white cube and the back projection as a source, which would emulate the cinemascope, and at the same time quoting from Warhol, Hockney, and in a way popular art, you could say, signatures, try to redo, the Western, but to have that very much interpolated by the experience of being in San Antonio and the Tex-Mex culture. And the site specificity of that work really comes out also in the collaboration with Javier de Frutas, the choreographer, who, in a way, was very much very inspired by the mythologies of the space. I mean, I have to say that when we have been looking at the work with it being newly conserved and looking at it, I was really quite, well, he says, the artist says, interested in our ways of thinking about making the kind of bricolage triptych format, and in a way many methodologies become sort of they start there, and it's shot in color reversal film, it has a technicolor look. All of these things, I think, were very novel at that time, and it's a work which enabled me to be nominated for the Turner Prize, and it was, in a way, a work that became recognized as part of the movement around the move for moving image works into a museum and gallery context, which was maybe slightly different from a previous generation. Yeah, so I think it's an important work, but it hasn't been shown for a very long time because, you have to conserve works like these, which are made almost 30 years ago, if you want to see them again in the cognitive sense that can be registered. Yeah, so, and you made me do that, Claudia.
Yes,
Thank you.
I pushed him towards that. Yeah, it was a hard negotiation, actually. But very important, because I think, we are so used to seeing multi-screen video installations these days that we forget how recent, in a way, this format is, and also what a pioneering role you really played in establishing it as within the museum context. And that's one of the reasons why I was so insistent on going back to the early work and bringing it into the context of this survey, because, as you just said, something fundamentally shifted at the time of how we relate to the moving image. We basically took it out of the cinema, and created a totally different experience, and your work was so quintessential in reformulating that. You also hinted at a couple of things while talking about Long Road to Mazatlan that have become really definitive characteristics of your work. And that is this interweaving of, references to other art forms, or not just references, the incorporation of other art and art forms into your work. You mentioned Hockney, you mentioned working with Javier, so dance, art, references to film, obviously. I mean, in here, the classic Western and others. That, to me, is also one of the defining features of your work, this sort of incredibly rich interweaving of all these different aesthetic tropes and traditions into a new vocabulary.
Yes, I mean, in a way, kind of, for example, the work Baltimore which has also been newly restored, which was shown here, is a work which, when it was shown at the Academy Museum, Doris Spurgeon invited me to show it in Los Angeles, and we had just started to think about doing some conservation work, and at that time we did the conservation work compensated by the projectors, but I knew that we had to go back to the celluloid. So now displayed here is the newly conserved version of the work. We also had to work on and redo the special effects because they got washed up in the Sandy storm. They were located in I-Beam's archival kind of, well, no, it was a digital storage space, but that didn't work. So we had to redo the special effects. £70,000 later, we have the newly restored Baltimore. And basically, in doing that, we realized that there are lots of things that we had never seen in terms of the original translation of the work from 16mm to digital that we got to see in this, revived version, a bit like painting when they do the conservation paintings. And I would say that in this work, it came about not really through my own genre, because of course, black action films, in my own work, I was kind of contesting. We wouldn't dream of making any sort of work that would be looking at the genre of blaxploitation films. I worked in a collective of black women filmmakers. It's a very problematic genre. But one of the things that I learned when I taught at Harvard, after deciding I had to do a course that would attract more students, is that I did a course called Blaxploitation Cinema de Quentin Tarantino. And we subsequently had 500 students that came to the course. But in that course, they had to read Laura Mulvey, the politics of spectatorship and its engendered phallocentrism. And you can imagine students didn't really enjoy that. But I thought it was good. And basically, one of the things that came out in my own research was really, in a way, revisiting blaxploitation films and realized, well, actually, they did save Hollywood, and actually, there were some very interesting films. And actually, Marvin Van Peebles made this film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, and it was a remarkable film. It's a film that would be banned now, of course, but it was a film that nonetheless it was a very queer film, I thought, as well, but it was a film which enabled me to think about when I was approached by the Museum of Art Wars by Lisa Corrin, who'd worked with Fred Wilson around reimagining museums and the interventions you can make with museums. So it's like a form of institutional critique. How can I make a work that would be like that, but different from it? And so Baltimore, bringing the Great Blacks in Wax Museum waxworks into the Waters Art Gallery to have a seance with Renaissance paintings was my aim. And also one of the other aims was really to think about how one could encapsulate some of the questions around kind of technology and science fiction through the works of Octavia Butler, and to have a kind of cyborg figure played by Vanessa Mairy, who actually worked as a production supervisor in Adam's editing offline suite. And she accepted the role, and there's a kind of, mixture in her character between, say, Foxy Brown, cyborg figure, and Melvin Van Peebles, who we decided to make a waxwork of him for the work, of which he very much enjoyed, but he did not want that waxwork to be in the Great Blackton Wax Museum collection as much as they did. It ended up being in the Studio Museum collection, so Thelma Godin has it now. And it's actually one of Michelle Obama's favorite artworks, I've been told. Yeah, but anyway, basically, So there's a doppelganger effect that appears at the end of the work, and in a way I would say that it's a question of thinking about formats and then thinking about the relationship to genres and their influence. I saw them as having this kind of rewriting of how I felt about genres, and it's also about my relationship to being in America, producing a work like Long Road to Bassaland, and then producing Baltimore. They're about the experiences of both working here and living here, and also in a way, the kind of fabric and intertextual quality becomes part of its, if you like, making. And in that work, it's when we use 5-point surround sound, it's when we begin to think about the screens being separated and that architectural presence, these sorts of questions, and the use of color in the space as opposed to the black cube motif, which was so popular for moving image works, and to break apart with that. So all of those things were coming into play in the making of this work.
And this format, the 3-screen, although in this case we're talking about walls really, installation then became the defining format for you really pretty much throughout the 2000s, although you did eventually use actual screens, right? You moved away from the wall and you came to actual screens. We said we might want to talk about Western Union as one example, although there are many, and I have images of all of them, so you can change your mind. But it's interesting to me to hear, especially hearing you talk now. I mean, being this with Baltimore being specifically about institutional critique, that there is this idea of being surrounded by walls that actually define architecture, right? And so that there's that relationship to the institution as both an idea and an archive and an arbiter of Western values that you're critiquing, but then also as a physical reality, right? In terms of built structure, which is very much sort of like embedded in your decision-making process about what you are projecting upon. You've dealt with institutional critique throughout your career, and the museum reoccurs throughout your oeuvre, and we're going to come back to that later on. But after Baltimore, you started a really important series of work that you have yourself called an expedition trilogy, although you have made more sort of like around work beyond that, around themes of migration, the diasporic condition. Can you talk a little bit about what triggered that and what made you dedicate yourself to that subject matter for nearly a decade?
Yeah, I mean, I think, 2004, a year after I made Baltimore, is when the the cockle shells tragedy happened in Morecambe Bay in north of England. And I began collecting newspaper reports, which is one of the things that I do. I collected them in the 80s and 90s, riots in Britain. I collected them around the beginning of this migrational movement. And I did the same in 2000, living here in America, where I, make those certain moments where it's important to do that. And I think in 10,000 Waves, which in a way, it kind of doesn't end that kind of expedition, but when I first made True North and Phantom Afrique, I mean, these are based on the expeditions of Matthew Henson with Perry, who went to the North Pole, and they're retraced through the footsteps of Vanessa Mairy, who, in a way, and of course there's an expedition through German Romantic Sublime, there's an expedition through the question of ecology and Lisa Bloom's book, Gender on Ice, very much influenced the making of the work, who's a student in Santa Cruz, in History of Consciousness, which is, where Mark and I teach now. And in a sense, this question of geology and geography were very much part of these works. And in a way, making Phantom Afrique, it became a way of thinking about the geographical spaces. Burkina Faso is also the center of the Ouagadougou Film Festival. So it's like the Cannes version of an African Cannes version of film festivals. It's a very francophone affair, but it's also a very important site, both geographically and culturally. So the question of expeditions were expanded upon during the crisis of people transporting themselves from Africa to mainland Europe. And the making of Western Union small boats, in a way, shifted that formally into the screens becoming floating screens. And the question of choreography, movement, and dance, of the idea of utilizing different forms which articulate movement, which are not necessarily translatable to a tabloid interpretation. And then at the same time, this kind of lyrical approach to a subject matter which might be deemed not appropriate for the subject matter, and to purposely kind of make that a way of trying to look at questions, difficult questions, which are also encapsulated in the histories of Italian cinema. Because, for example, this work also is quoting the shot in Palazzo Gangi where the leopard was shot. That famous film, The Leopard, and the famous ballroom sequence where the dance becomes inverted with Russell Mellifant choreographing, as it were, an underwater dance on the palazzo floor. So I like this idea of translations or quotations, and then basically the way that the documentary, the indexical, makes an intervention into those images. And a comment on the relationship between what I see as a provincial argument around migration, which is part of the European-American conversation, and using a work like 10,000 Waves, where we escape the free screen format and try to make a epistemological turn in terms of expanding the question of choreography. And that question of choreography gets expanded upon because we made an experiment when we had a show at the Pompidou collection with a work which I know you wanted to show, Phantom Creole.
We're debating that.
We were debating it. It's a four-screen work which encapsulates True North and Phantom Creole, or Phantom Afrique, into a four-screen work. And what we did is that we got the screens to surround the audience when it was shown at the Pompidou, and we put all the chairs in the middle, and we said, ha-ha, they can watch the work from different positions. And all they did is they grabbed the cushions and moved to the back where they could see all the screens all at once, So that attempt failed from my point of view. And that led me to an Adam to make a work where it would be purposely designed where the audience could have a more playful relationship to spectating. And that's when we decided to make the 9 screen of 10,000 Waves. And 10,000 Waves also points to, in a way, the area of the screens fully separated, and the question of choreography and the question of montage being edited through the space, through the 9.2 surround sound, but also through the use of the screens, And when we did this, of course, we did it because we know that there are lots of people who are following the work that we're doing. We thought, well, this might be a bit more difficult to emulate by others as well. he says. But of course, I mean, it was not. I mean, some people emulated it in a very interesting manner, you know. And I believe, you know, The Visitors, you know, which is, you know, SFMO is one of those works that does it very interestingly. But I think in this work, it was very much thinking about the way that then we could look at the space and to look at the question of journeying and expedition, you know, not through the European lens, but to look at it through Mazu, here, Maggie Chong, who plays Mazu, and to think about journeying and, you know, the question of syncopation and choreography as a way that can be part of rethinking the way that multiple screens are displayed and shown, and in a way catching up to the new technologies which enable us to do this, and at the same time to think about a part of the world where migration has been part of its culture for thousands and thousands of years, to the Ming period, people from the Fujian province, and the provinciality that migration is, as it were, part of a discourse and practice, but in the West, you know. And so, you know, there's lots of points of critique from my point of view making the work, but it's also work that is, you know, yeah, it becomes a paradigmatic shift, I would say. Maybe Adam agrees, I don't know. Yep.
I mean, for me, definitely, it's the paradigmatic shift. I mean, if we look at your practice overall, especially now that we have the luxury to sort of like, you know, have all these works together in one space. And of course, you have carried sort of that paradigmatic shift into works that you've made after 10,000 Waves. Most notably the ones that we have, you know, here on view, being Lessons of the Hour in its 10-screen version, Lina Bo Bardi, which we are showing in a 3-screen version, but does exist in a 9-screen version as well. And most recently, of course, once again, Statues Never Die, which again demands a different form of interaction on the viewer's part with the work. And I'm just really interested in you know, the decision-making processes that go into sort of the formats of the presentation too. It's like, you know, because they're all very specific and very different. Like if I think of Lessons of the Hours, it's a work that's, you know, expanded over 10 screens, of very specifically scaled size screens. When you're shooting the work, when you're going into, you know, the making of it with Adam, obviously, do you already have sort of a scenario, a presentation scenario in mind? Or is that something that you develop as you're reviewing the footage, as you are looking at the imagery that you collect and that Adam edits, you know, for you, with you? Obviously, it's a collaborative process. You know, how do you arrive at sort of like those key moments of realizing this needs to be a 10-screen video installation?
Well, I mean, a work like 10,000 Waves was, in a way, deliberately orchestrated as a 9-screen work, so it was very intentional. But a work like...
From the beginning.
Yeah, from the beginning. We started working on the drawings for the choreography, the screens, how they would be, you know, because we had to think about that if we were going to make a 9-screen work. But in the case of Lessons of the Hour, it didn't begin as a 10-screen work. In fact, I mean, it began as, I believe it might have been a 5-screen work. I mean, I think Jonathan who commissioned the work, and Adam might remember better than I do. But then basically it began as a work that would have a film component that was going to be in black and white film, and you would move into another space where you would have the revelation of the work as a multiple screen work. But one of the things that dawned on me while making the work was really going back to a previous installation I had worked on for the films of Derek Jarman when I did a collaboration with Tilda Swinton on the portrait of Derek, and then worked on an exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery where we displayed some of his Super 8 films, and we, in a way, appropriated a kind of salon hang for that work, and I felt that a salon hang would be very instrumental for making this work when we were in the middle of making and editing the work. And I guess the reason why I thought about that, it was very influenced by Frederick Douglass's own work, and interest in art and painting and photography, and in a way it felt appropriate. So I don't know, I think Adam might have been sighing halfway through this process, but I think one of the things which was really exciting about making the work once we made that decision was really about then what would be the different value systems to the different size screens, and how could we play with this format, which was emulating 19th century salon hang kind of technique, and then at the same time, to move it into the 21st century, because we're looking at Douglass, of course, through that lens. And I would say that, I've been working on sort of research, and we came across a wonderful author. Her name is called Celeste Barnier, who's sitting over here. And it was through Celeste Barnier's pivotal work around Frederick Douglass that we were able to, as it were, bring together all of the visual methodologies and the textual qualities, both in relationship to Douglass. And I would say the main shift in that work is the beginning and then that kind of epilogue aspect when it shifts in time and we are in the present, although the question between the past and the present is always fluid in the work, but the fireworks, which become part of the celebration for what to the slave is a 4th of July speech, which are then presented through their display, and then the Freddie Gray riots, which occurred in the city, in Baltimore, perhaps a few streets from where Frederick Douglass lived in the 19th century, displayed through the footage, which was the surveillance footage used by the police. Because, of course, Douglass's thesis around photography and his aesthetic ideas, because, of course, he's an abolitionist, he had been able to, through his own writing and astonishing use of language, to write about his experience of being a slave, but he's also concerned with these aesthetic questions, and photography was one of them, being the most photographed man of the 19th century, using his own sense of portraiture to read against the racial pathology of the time, and then thinking about what are the technologies of photography today, what are they doing, what is the surveillance footage doing, why is it mapping these demonstrations in this particular manner, does the technology have the same nature? So, I think all of those questions became part of it. And the tapestry was formed through the presentation of the work, in this red room, and just, in a way, bringing all these questions into the 21st century in this display.
You've talked a little bit about montage in the beginning. You were sort of like, saying this is what we learn in art school and film school. But obviously, like you've mentioned Eisenstein as, as a reference that everybody learns, sort of like, film 101, I guess. But montage is the defining format of your work. And maybe as we go into speaking about once again, maybe as the last example and the final example of our talk, but also the sort of, the most recent work in the show. Maybe you could talk a little more about how you really have radically reframed the concept of montage, from, let's say, its dialectical origins, which is Eisenstein's approach to it, which is, of course, deeply connected to the Hegelian concept of dialectics and all its exclusionary mechanisms. So for you to talk a little bit about, how you have taken that framework and injected it with ideas, that we've talked a lot about Glissant, we've talked a lot about Deleuze, we've talked a lot about other people, sort of like how you really have defined your own sort of like conception and reality of montage that comes into play and that makes your work so powerful and so generous and so inclusive, where, I think I'd love to close on that.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's a way in which the question of radical montage aesthetic is something which I've always been interested in. And I think it's really about the idea of unlearning the way that we look and the habits that we take for granted in looking. It's about the way that the gaze can be returned, but also at the same time made estranged in looking, and the reasons why we come to a museum or why we look at film or look at the art, all of those questions I think are laid at the door as a sort of question mark. And I think also there's a way in which, if we think about the bricolage approach, Eisenstein's montage of attractions ideas, I mean, there is a sort of translation into the way that kind of new technologies have demanded a rewriting, a repicturing of the way that we look and experience images. There's a real lack of, I think, understanding about their circulation, how they win elections, how they create consent, how they politically marshal populations into ways of thinking that people unquestionably don't question necessarily. And so I'm just interested in just making hints at those sorts of things. But I would say in a work like, once again, I mean, there's a return to some of the questions, modernist questions, which were part of Looking for Langston. But it's also an attempt of thinking about, because this work was made during the pandemic, COVID pandemic, and I thought about this in relationship to when I made Looking for Langston, which was made during the AIDS pandemic. And I was thinking a lot about the questions of mourning, and then what could be a kind of, using Bell Hook's terms, a kind of, well, there are two things that are going on, because in this work it's about the question around the return of objects that were taken from violent conditions, which are part of a museum history and collection practice. But then at the same time, what do those objects mean to their Black diasporian populations? And so there are these different debates which are taking place. And of course, the American debate around modernism, which ignored Barthes and all its various actors, which are part of an African-American history, but part of an American art history, are there sort of in erasure. We had the Met exhibition, but they're kind of still in erasure. And they're there in a way that that's not really examined. But you have people, protagonists like Alan Locke, Barnes. This was a commission by the Barnes Museum. And in this commission, is really looking at how can we reframe and look at these debates. He was a great collector, and he was one of the first, if you like, collectors who was doing this question of the influence of African art in Western art, of course, following artists' footsteps, Picasso, Modigliani, etc. But there was also another question that was hovering around this work, which is what bell hooks called the diasporic dream space, and how one could make a work where the question of the imaginary could become a real political force for rethinking the future, and how can that become a way that we can, have a different relationship to, struggles, and how does poetry become part of that as a way of looking forward? Because one of the things that we've found, that when we were making this work, that we had to go back to the 50s to find poetic protests as texts, to think about the ways in which people are responding to questions around reparation. And I thought that was very interesting. So in a way, I see this work as a form of activism, but it's through the poetic, and it's really through thinking about the cognitive and how that can be made into a space for meditation around these sorts of questions.
Thank you very much. I realize that we're at time, so this might be a good moment to take some questions from the audience, if there are any.
Okay, thank you. First of all, what an amazing show. And what a fantastic opportunity to also rediscover earlier work. And I'm particularly interested in hearing you, Isaac, talk about your experience of reviewing older work. And is there an example where you thought this was about one thing and today you think this is about something else? Has your view on some earlier work changed today, like you may have changed or we have all changed?
I mean, I think, there's always a difference between the curatorial interests and that of the artists, you could say. And so, and I think, my partner is a curator, Mark Nash, so we have conversations every day. He was involved in Documentary 11, he worked very closely with Ocwi Mwezo, and he partners a lot with me on all my projects. And so we have these curatorial conversations every day, about the role of moving images, how they play and out in our society, and then, with Claudia's, request to look at the archive, look at one's own archive, one had to go back literally into one's own archive and to reconserve those works. So of course it is fascinating, he says, when you look at works like The Long Road to Mazatlan, for example, and think about the role of new queer cinema, which, Ruby Rich, had pioneered, and then thinking about how that was going to be excavated in the world of the art, video art world, in a work like Long Road to Mazatlan, and then the aesthetic choices and the question of time, and we're thinking about the way that time changes how you look, and a work like True North. Would I make a work like True North today? Probably not. Or Phantom Afrique. So, the question of time, how it changes how you look, and then having to be very sensitive to, the new technology is not influencing too much the cognitive shift, in what you're doing, So I think all of those things are very important. But, you know, would I have done all of these things if Claudia hadn't maybe do them? Probably not, you know. You know, I might have done them, not all at once. Yeah, so, yeah.
There's another mic coming next to you. Great.
Thanks so much for this fantastic conversation and this wonderful exhibition. And my compliments, Claudia, also to the signage throughout, which is so wonderful. And I just wanted to comment on a footnote, which is Lost Boundaries, which I had never seen before, and where you are showing some of Isaac's own Super 8 documentation from the early years. And so I'm curious, Isaac, since you're never without your iPhone and always have a very good lens, is there a photography exhibition in the future? Are there photography montages in the future? I wonder if looking back at that early work of documentation that you had done has inspired any thoughts of other formats going forward. That's all.
Well, I mean, the thing about that work, Lost Boundaries, is really a behind the scenes of the filmmaking of The Patch of Remembrance, a film which I made with the Psycho-Film Collective in 1986, which I believe is Angela Davis's favourite film. You know, I think she thinks
The only good one you ever made, I thought, according to her, no?
Yes. I think I went downhill since then, you know, in Angela's eyes. And, you know, but I think there's a way in which, you know, documenting that work with the Super 8 camera, you know, was important. And so, I mean, the fact is we all have our iPhones, we document all the time. I mean, the only problem is it's not on Super 8. And so the thing is, Dan, what will happen to all of those images in the future? Yeah. So if you're not archiving them, but they're up there in the cloud, which I don't think is a form of archiving, but we've been told it is. Yeah. And then how do those forms translate to the new technologies of the future? Yeah. So I think that's, I don't know, I can answer that question. But I think there's something about celluloid and the fact that it's a material and the fact that that is translatable to other mediums. But of course, you know, this is all fiction because did AI play a role in some of the work that I did? Yes. You know, so, you know, we lost all of the film negative for the passion, for all the scenes shot in St. Lucia in Paradise Omoros. And it was AI that was able to help not reconstruct the scenes, but it helped. I won't go into how it helped, but it helped, you know, that translation of the negative that was not available. So we don't know what the future holds. It could be very interesting or not. Yeah, yeah. So.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk and work, of course. I wanted to ask a question about just, you know, you talk about these cognitive shifts, you know, that you, in a way that you sort of trying to create a context for a cognitive shift to also take place for the viewer. And I was thinking about, you know, there's the protagonists in the films, there's the sound, there's landscape and architecture, as well as the actual space that the viewer themselves is in, makes you feel like you're in that, you know, environment too. And the incredible emotional quality of the work. And so I, you know, would like to hear what you think about, or how you think about landscape and architecture and, I mean, even color in helping visitors or viewers to make those kinds of cognitive shifts that may be occurring on other levels also, and not entirely cognitive.
Well, in a way, I think it's all about the way that the kind of aesthetics of the sonic and, you know, their role that they play in creating a habitat, or the kind of visceral haptic relationship to, you know, how screens are placed, and, you know, because, I mean, some people make multiple screen works, or they make free screen works, you know. I mean, I don't know why they make them. I know why I made them in the beginning, and I know why I might not, you know. So, I mean, I think it's more to do with the exploration of what it is that you're involved in, and then what it is that you want to achieve. I mean, I think, you know, in my work, I'm very interested in the idea of empathy. You know, how can you create empathy? And, you know, I mean, I think, you know, some artists are not. I mean, but if you are, then you know that it's a question of sonography, one image, how it's placed next to another, the space between images. That's a whole chapter in our Tate catalogue between Mark and Adam. The space between images are as important as the images themselves, you know, and all of those things which are kind of resonating in their invisible ways, but also, you know, signifying. So I think, and we know that we're in this very, robotic culture, you know, where images are being catapulted at us every minute, you know. So we have a right for distrust of images, you know. There could be a right for return to painting, you know, and all of those sorts of things. And we're right to distrust them. But I think, you know, there's another aspect, you know, in, making them, which can perform another sort of, you know, intervention, you know. But how all of those other aspects, the sonic, and all those things are important, you know. And the cognitive differences are just the fact that, you know, how we look now and how we looked before are different. And they're being that difference is being dictated. You know, when we work on catalogues, we have so many, you know, disagreements, you know, with designers, for example, who want the image to be at this level of, like, you know, and it kind of gets dictated, you know, and you slowly know that how people are looking is completely shifting, kind of minute by minute, you know, and yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I don't know how much we take effect of that. And in a subliminal sense, it's the same way that images work on a culture, in the dominant culture, to form opinions and points of views.
So, Isaac, I would love to have you pick up right from where you just ended in terms of the politics of what the way images work now. I love the fact that the talk so far has been so focused on the formal qualities of the work and unpacking the montage and thinking about that. But I'm wondering, when you look at the history of, 30 years of practice, the politics that motivated the early works, how do you see those politics having shifted and changed? And what type of loop are we in now? And when you think more deeply about loss and grievance that I feel that is embodied in parts of your work, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the political moment we're in culturally now.
I mean, in a way, I would say that these things work in uncanny ways. So, if I look at Lessons of the Hour, for example, when Ken made his speech, in relationship to his own ancestry, you know, and historical formation, you know, I realized, you know, there's a history that's resonating side by side to histories which, you know, don't recognize those histories, you know, that are living side by side, you know. And the thing is that, you know, in a way, what were the aesthetic strategies which were being utilized at particular moments in time, you know? So, you know, so my question is, you know, for example, why did Frederick Douglass write about the role of photography when people were asking him to talk about the role of abolitionism and slavery at a particular moment? And so, I mean, I think, in a way, it's about how can we not always be reactive to the demands that are being politically orchestrated or postulated, to make things which can have a life beyond their immediacy. Yeah, and you know, and that's what I'm kind of interested in doing. But it took me a long time to work that one out. Wasn't worked out overnight.
Well, thank you for your questions. Thank you, Isaac, for this conversation.
Thank you, Claudia.
And thank you for giving us a place to believe in images again.
Okay, thank you.